Childhood trauma is like an earthquake in the brain, and the cracks last a lifetime. This powerful metaphor captures something profound that Dr. Gabor Maté has spent decades helping us understand through his groundbreaking work in trauma psychology. When we think about earthquakes, we picture the ground shaking violently, buildings cracking, foundations shifting, and the landscape forever changed. This is exactly what happens in a developing child's brain when trauma strikes. The neural pathways that are still forming, the emotional regulation systems that are just beginning to stabilize, and the fundamental sense of safety that should anchor a child's world all get disrupted in ways that create lasting imprints. The science behind this metaphor is both fascinating and heartbreaking. During childhood, our brains are in a constant state of development, with neural connections forming at an incredible rate. These connections don't just determine how we think, they shape how we feel, how we react to stress, and how we relate to others throughout our entire lives. When trauma occurs during these critical developmental windows, it's like an earthquake hitting a construction site. The foundation that's being laid gets damaged, the structural integrity becomes compromised, and the building that emerges may look fine from the outside but carries invisible vulnerabilities that can affect its stability for decades to come. What makes childhood trauma particularly devastating is that children don't have the cognitive or emotional resources to process these experiences the way adults might. They can't rationalize what's happening, they can't create meaning from chaos, and they certainly can't protect themselves from the overwhelming flood of stress hormones that trauma releases into their developing systems. Instead, their young brains do what they must to survive. They adapt. They create coping mechanisms, defensive strategies, and ways of being in the world that help them navigate danger when they were small and powerless. The problem is that these survival adaptations, while brilliant and necessary at the time, often become the very patterns that create suffering in adult life. The child who learned to be hypervigilant to avoid unpredictable anger might become an adult who can never truly relax. The child who discovered that being perfect might prevent abandonment could grow into someone who drives themselves to exhaustion trying to earn love. The child who found safety in invisibility might struggle with intimacy and connection as an adult. These aren't character flaws or personal failures. They're the lasting cracks from that early earthquake, still influencing how the structure responds to pressure. Understanding trauma through Maté's lens means recognizing that what we often label as mental illness, addiction, or behavioral problems are actually normal responses to abnormal circumstances. The child's brain did exactly what it was designed to do in the face of threat. It prioritized immediate survival over long-term well-being. The stress response systems went into overdrive, the attachment systems got disrupted, and the developing sense of self learned to organize around danger rather than safety and connection. This perspective is both sobering and deeply compassionate. It means that the adult struggling with anxiety isn't broken or weak. They're carrying the imprint of a nervous system that learned early to expect danger. The person battling addiction isn't lacking willpower. They may be unconsciously trying to regulate an emotional system that never learned healthy self-soothing. The individual who struggles with relationships isn't selfish or difficult. They might be operating from attachment patterns that formed when trust felt impossible. The earthquake metaphor also helps us understand why healing from childhood trauma is such a complex and ongoing process. You can't simply think your way out of trauma, because the damage isn't just in your conscious mind. It's embedded in your nervous system, your stress responses, and your deepest beliefs about yourself and the world. Just as repairing earthquake damage requires understanding the structural integrity of the entire building, healing trauma requires attention to the whole person, their body, their emotions, their relationships, and their sense of meaning and purpose. One of the most profound insights from Maté's work is recognizing how early trauma shapes our fundamental assumptions about life. When a child experiences neglect, abuse, or other forms of trauma, they don't just remember these events, they internalize messages about their worth, their safety, and their place in the world. They might conclude that they're unlovable, that the world is dangerous, that they can't trust their own perceptions, or that their needs don't matter. These beliefs become like invisible operating systems, running in the background and influencing every interaction, every decision, and every relationship. The cracks from childhood trauma show up in countless ways throughout adult life. They might appear as chronic health conditions because the stress of early trauma literally changes how the immune system develops. They could manifest as struggles with emotional regulation, relationships that feel overwhelming or suffocating, or a persistent sense that something is fundamentally wrong even when life looks good on paper. Sometimes the cracks are obvious, like addiction or mental health crises, but often they're more subtle, showing up as a general sense of unease, difficulty with intimacy, or patterns of self-sabotage that seem to come from nowhere. What's particularly challenging about these trauma imprints is that they often feel like truth rather than historical adaptations. The adult who learned early that expressing needs leads to rejection might genuinely believe that they're too much for other people. The person who discovered that emotions were dangerous might feel convinced that vulnerability equals weakness. These aren't just thoughts or beliefs that can be easily changed through positive thinking. They're embodied experiences that feel as real and immediate as the original trauma. But here's where hope enters the picture, and this is something that Maté emphasizes repeatedly in his work. While the cracks from childhood trauma may last a lifetime, they don't have to define or limit that lifetime. Understanding trauma as an earthquake in the brain isn't meant to create despair or resignation. It's meant to foster compassion and realistic expectations for the healing process. When we understand why we respond the way we do, when we recognize that our struggles make perfect sense given our history, we can begin to approach ourselves with kindness rather than judgment. The human brain's capacity for change, what scientists call neuroplasticity, means that even deep trauma imprints can be modified over time. New experiences of safety, connection, and understanding can literally rewire neural pathways. Therapy that addresses trauma at the body level, not just the cognitive level, can help regulate nervous systems that learned early to live in survival mode. Relationships that offer consistent safety and attunement can provide corrective experiences that begin to heal old attachment wounds. Have you ever noticed how certain situations or interactions can trigger responses that seem completely out of proportion to what's actually happening? Maybe a comment from a friend sends you into a spiral of self-doubt, or a small conflict at work leaves you feeling like your entire world is falling apart. These moments often point to where the old earthquake cracks are still sensitive, where past trauma is intersecting with present experience. Recognizing these patterns isn't about pathologizing normal human responses. It's about developing the awareness that allows us to respond from our adult selves rather than our traumatized child selves. I want to take a moment here to thank everyone who clicked on this video and is taking time out of their day to explore these important topics with me. The fact that you're here, listening to content about trauma and healing, suggests that you're someone who's committed to understanding yourself and others more deeply. That takes courage, especially when we're talking about painful topics like childhood trauma. Your willingness to engage with this material, whether for your own healing journey or to better understand someone you care about, makes a difference not just in your own life but in the lives of everyone you touch. The question becomes, how do we live with awareness of these earthquake cracks without becoming overwhelmed by them? How do we honor the reality of trauma's lasting impact while still believing in our capacity for growth and healing? This is one of the central challenges that anyone dealing with trauma must navigate, and it's something that Maté addresses with both honesty and hope throughout his work. One key insight is learning to distinguish between what belongs to the past and what belongs to the present. This isn't always easy because trauma has a way of collapsing time, making old threats feel current and immediate. But with practice and often with support, we can begin to notice when we're responding to ghosts from the past rather than actual dangers in the present. We can learn to ask ourselves questions like, is this feeling proportionate to what's actually happening right now? Or, what would I tell a friend who was experiencing this same situation? Another crucial aspect of healing involves learning to befriend our nervous system rather than fighting against it. When we understand that hypervigilance, emotional numbness, or intense reactivity are actually protective mechanisms that once served us well, we can begin to appreciate these responses rather than judging them. This doesn't mean we have to stay stuck in these patterns, but it means we can approach change from a place of curiosity and compassion rather than criticism and force. The process of healing from childhood trauma often involves grieving not just what happened, but what didn't happen. Children need consistent safety, attunement, and validation to develop a secure sense of self and healthy relationships. When these needs weren't met, there's a real loss to acknowledge. This grief isn't self-pity or dwelling in the past. It's a necessary part of healing that allows us to fully feel and integrate our experience so we can move forward with greater wholeness. Community and connection play vital roles in trauma recovery, which makes sense when we remember that trauma often occurs in the context of relationships and that healing naturally happens in relationship as well. This doesn't necessarily mean intensive therapy, though that can certainly be helpful. It might mean finding friends who can listen without trying to fix, joining groups where shared experiences create understanding, or simply practicing vulnerability in small, safe ways that gradually expand our capacity for intimacy. One of the most liberating aspects of understanding trauma through this earthquake metaphor is recognizing that healing doesn't require us to become perfect or to completely eliminate all traces of our early experiences. The goal isn't to repair every crack until the building looks brand new. The goal is to strengthen the overall structure so it can weather future storms with greater resilience. Some cracks might always be visible, some vulnerabilities might always require extra attention, and that's not failure. That's simply the reality of being human in a world where hurt happens. Speaking of being human, can I ask you for a small favor that's totally related to our topic today? Just like how healing from trauma happens through connection and positive reinforcement, this channel grows through your engagement and support. So if this content is resonating with you, if it's helping you understand yourself or someone you care about a little better, would you mind hitting that like button? Think of it as a small act of connection, a way of saying, "This matters," that helps these conversations reach other people who might need to hear them. No pressure though, just like healing, engagement has to come from an authentic place. What's particularly powerful about Maté's approach to trauma is how it shifts us away from asking, "What's wrong with you?" toward asking, "What happened to you?" This simple reframe can be revolutionary both in how we view ourselves and how we understand others. Instead of seeing symptoms as evidence of personal deficiency, we begin to see them as evidence of the human spirit's incredible capacity to adapt and survive even under the most difficult circumstances. This perspective has profound implications for how we approach healing. Rather than trying to eliminate symptoms or force ourselves to be different, we can begin to understand our patterns and responses as information about our history and our needs. The person who struggles with trust isn't broken. They learned early that trust could be dangerous. The individual who has difficulty with emotional intimacy isn't cold or unfeeling. They may have discovered that emotional expression led to punishment or abandonment. The earthquake metaphor also helps us understand why trauma affects different people differently. Just as buildings with different foundations and construction will respond differently to the same earthquake, children with different temperaments, support systems, and circumstances will be affected differently by similar traumatic experiences. This isn't about ranking trauma or determining whose experience was worse. It's about recognizing that each person's response makes sense within the context of their particular circumstances and inner resources. Resilience, from this perspective, isn't something people either have or don't have. It's something that develops through experience, particularly through experiences of having our distress met with comfort and understanding. Children who experience trauma but also have consistent, caring relationships may develop different coping strategies than children who face trauma in isolation. This understanding can help reduce the shame that often surrounds trauma responses and replace it with a more nuanced appreciation for the complexity of human adaptation. The healing journey often involves learning to provide for ourselves what we needed but didn't receive as children. This might mean learning to comfort ourselves when we're distressed, to validate our own experiences and emotions, or to set boundaries that protect our well-being. It's a process of becoming a good parent to our own inner child, offering the consistency, safety, and unconditional positive regard that allows healing to unfold naturally. One of the most challenging aspects of trauma recovery can be learning to tolerate hope. When you've lived with the cracks from an early earthquake for a long time, hope can feel dangerous because it makes you vulnerable to disappointment. Many trauma survivors develop what might be called protective pessimism, expecting the worst so they won't be caught off guard. Learning to risk hope, to believe that things can be different, is often a crucial part of the healing process. This is where the support of others becomes invaluable. We often need other people to hold hope for us when we can't hold it for ourselves. We need people who can see our worth when we can't, who can remain calm when we're overwhelmed, and who can offer the steady presence that our nervous systems need to begin to relax and trust. This kind of healing relationship doesn't have to be with a professional therapist, though therapy can certainly provide this. It might happen with friends, family members, support groups, or mentors who understand the nature of trauma and recovery. The journey of healing from childhood trauma is rarely linear. There are often setbacks, moments when old patterns resurface with surprising intensity, and times when progress feels impossible. Understanding trauma as an earthquake helps normalize these experiences. Just as aftershocks can continue long after the initial earthquake, trauma responses can be triggered by events that remind us of past experiences. This doesn't mean we're not healing or that we're going backward. It means we're human beings with complex nervous systems that remember what they've learned about survival. Integration becomes the goal rather than elimination. The aim isn't to forget or completely overcome our traumatic experiences, but to integrate them into a larger story of resilience, growth, and meaning. The cracks from the earthquake become part of the building's character, perhaps even sources of strength and uniqueness. Many trauma survivors find that their experiences, while painful, have also given them depth, empathy, and wisdom that they wouldn't trade away. As we near the end of our exploration today, I want to reflect on what it means to carry the cracks from childhood trauma while still living a meaningful and fulfilling life. The earthquake metaphor reminds us that damage doesn't mean destruction. Buildings can be repaired, reinforced, and made beautiful even after they've been shaken. The same is true for human beings. Our early experiences shape us, but they don't have to limit us. The cracks can become places where light gets in, where compassion grows, and where our humanity becomes most visible and powerful. Living with awareness of trauma's impact means accepting both our vulnerabilities and our strengths, both our wounds and our capacity for healing. It means being patient with the process, gentle with ourselves on difficult days, and open to the possibility that our deepest struggles might also be sources of our greatest gifts. The person who learned early about pain might become someone who can sit with others in their pain. The individual who survived chaos might develop an appreciation for peace that others take for granted. The child who felt invisible might grow into an adult who sees and validates others with exceptional clarity. Thank you for joining me today in this exploration of childhood trauma and its lasting effects. If this content has resonated with you, if it's offered you a new way of understanding yourself or someone you care about, I'd be grateful if you'd give it a like. Your engagement helps these important conversations reach others who might benefit from them. More than that, though, if this discussion has stirred up thoughts, memories, or insights that you'd like to share, I invite you to leave a comment below. Sometimes sharing our experiences can be part of the healing process, and your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If you found value in this video, you might also enjoy the next one that's appearing on your screen, or consider subscribing to the Not What It Seems channel if you feel called to continue this journey of understanding and healing together.